repeat to you, gentlemen, that your inquisition is fruitless. Detain me here forever if you will. Confine or execute me, if you must have a victim to propitiate the illusion you call justice. But I can say no more than I have said already. Everything that I can remember, I have told you with perfect candor. Nothing has been distorted or concealed, and if anything remains vague, it is only because of the dark cloud which has come over my mind. That cloud and the nebulous nature of the horrors which brought it upon me. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Carr-Quest of H.P. Lovecraft, still going with the Dream Quest. And today we will be covering the story, I'll hold it up again, The Statement of Randolph Carter. Now, now that name may ring a bell, especially if you saw this episode title and you go, wait a second, Randolph Carter. That's a name that's a name that sounds just a little bit familiar. Well, I'll tell you, because Randolph Carter is technically a character that we have met already. If you remember the last season, we covered a story called The Silver Key. And in that story is where we technically first met, at least in this series, Randolph Carter. Now this is also, I think this is actually the first story in which Randolph Carter first actually appears. So this is where we first legitimately get introduced to Randolph Carter. So that's really cool. I also remember, I said in the last episode, which was Doom That Came to Sarnath, that this was one of my favorite Lovecraft stories, and it still is. The basic plot of it, though, and it's a pretty short story. It's around 6-ish pages, I think. But the story is basically about, Randolph Carter, who is being interviewed by the police or some sort of authority on whatever happened the night before involving a friend of his who's been doing some dark and sinister studies into the unknown, named Harley Warren, and specifically what they did last night at Big Cypress Swamp, or at least a cemetery around there. So this is I think this is actually, I will admit, I did kind of not rush through this story. I think because I didn't listen to a Horror Babble audiobook, kind of similar to last episode. Instead, I actually read the story while listening to the audiobook by Nuke the Shoggoth, who I think did a pretty good job of reading it. And it's very interesting also about Statement of Randolph Carter, because it's one of the first Lovecraft stories which I ever read. I wouldn't say it's it's one of the first anyway, there with Color Out of Space or Dagon, but we won't be getting to Dagon until future stuff. But anyway, so you're probably thinking to yourself, Andrew, what of the actual story though? I think the story is actually really well done. I think it builds hold on, the camera's a little weird right there. I think like a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories, especially the best Lovecraft stories, it builds tension. It builds this atmosphere of dread, and it does it very well. I think especially because it does establish from the beginning that Randolph Carter has told this sort of story to the authorities, maybe even to the authorities. Well, it does kind of establish from the first line that he has been talking to these authorities for a while. And he's repeated this story time and time again. And for whatever reason, they're like, well, I don't know, I guess sort of questioning purposes. They're trying to get more out of him. But he's like, I can't remember everything. And I think that's really interesting too, that he can't really remember absolutely everything that happened between him and Warren in that cemetery. And I think that does really uh there is kind of that level of an unreliable narrator, to use a literary lingo. Um, and I will say, towards the end, it does sometimes. Uh, Lovecraft does sometimes write it where it's like, oh, for most of it, it's like, oh, I can't remember absolutely everything, and then a couple times, like especially towards the end, he does kind of say like, oh, and now as I remember it, I remember things that Harley Warren said to me, you know, over the telephone, or it is kind of like, okay, I thought that was kind of, it's like, oh, just now as I'm recollecting it, but it allows for the story to kind of progress there. Um and Yeah, so what are some other things I want? Oh, more just kind of about Carter himself as a character. Um, I haven't read everything involving Randolph Carter. One of the stories later on is like the one of the big ones, especially with Randolph Carter. Um, but for some sort of additional details about his character, and something that Harley Warren even kind of mentions, when Randolph is regaling the tale towards the end, Randolph Carter is, I think, even to quote Harley Warren, is a bundle of nerves. He's quick to like anxiety. He's quick to become anxious and scared and stuff. And I think it's really interesting also because having a character who to a certain extent is an unreliable narrator, and B is because again, towards the end of the story, when it is really like ramping up, we do also get it from the whole story is pretty much from Randolph's perspective, but he describes how he gets more nervous and like finicky and like sort of asking more and more questions, and he can't really bring himself to say anything else more than the questions he keeps asking. And the fact that Randolph Carter is pretty much like one of the major characters in the dream cycle and plays a huge role in one of the later and longest dream cycle stories. It's just an interesting choice of protagonist, and the fact that we also that it does continue on with Randolph Carter. Um, I just thought that was kind of interesting that we do kind of have a not a coward, but a a very anxious character, a very just quick to. I think at this point I'm just kind of repeating myself, but I think that is an interesting choice for not only a main character, but a recurring main character across several more works in the dream cycle. So, yeah, the Statement of Randolph Carter, it's a great story. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. As well, I do think it is up there with Color Out of Space, Music of Eric Zahn, Call of Cthulhu. I think it is like a high A-ish. Um, yeah, I think A, like a high A. The tension is really good. It really does build up the relationship between Harley and Randolph. That they were friends, and that whatever happened in the in the cemetery, it's like, I know not what truly happened to him, but I hope he's resting in like peaceful oblivion. I think that's how he describes it. So yeah, I think this is a really good story. Again, I'd give it a high A. And the next story on our list, uh, and I'll probably explain this either I explain it on Instagram, but I might explain it like at the beginning of this or something. That the reason I'm kind of rushing, if it feels like I'm rushing this episode, it's also because I have a family wedding this week. I think actually tomorrow I fly out. I fly out there, me and my brother and my dad, and I might have the next episode up, just like as a live YouTube premiere, which should be fun. But so yeah, so that's why I am kind of like in case you were like wondering. But anyway, as to the next story in our Carr-Quest of H.P. Lovecraft, we have another one which I really like, The Cats of Ulthar. So until then, ladies, gentlemen, and gender non-conforming people, my name is Andrew Carr. This has been the Carr-Quest of H.P. Lovecraft. And until then, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.